You're listening to Wildlife Control Consultant, where we provide research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest management. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, your host of Wildlife Control Consultant podcast, where we discuss all things research-based related to vertebrate pest management. Hey, glad to have you on board. I hope you had a good week. I am stacking up a variety of podcasts here because we're coming up to the holiday season, and once January midway comes through, I'm going to be doing some traveling, of course, and so things are going to get a little hairy. So I'm trying to get a stack of podcasts already out there scheduled to drop so that I have some breathing room and finishing up another project that I need to deal with as well. So anyways, enough about me. I hope you'll take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel and to reach out to me. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Just spotlighting today one of my books. I think this was my first or second book, the Wildlife Removal Handbook, and so it's gone through a few editions, and so it basically lays a really good foundation for you to control a variety of the common species that are found in North America, as defined as the United States and southern Canada. So if you're looking to get into the wildlife control business, this is certainly a good place to start. If you're not, perhaps you're a property owner and you're wanting to perhaps learn some of the techniques that professionals use to resolve problems, this would also be rather a good exercise for you to read. And so at least if you don't end up doing it yourself, you would at least know what the professionals should be up to before you pay them. But nevertheless, you can get this from my website. Again, the website is wildlifecontrolconsultant.com. All right, well, let me get my presentation. As you know, we've been working through a deep dive on the active ingredient Brodifacoum, and I thought I would only have 4, but I was mistaken. I still have a 5th one to drop, I should say, and then a 6th one possibly, but I'm going to take a break. I'm not going to do those 2 additional ones. The 6th one's not quite ready yet, so I'm going to take a little break here. I'm sure you're thinking, gosh, there's more to the world than Brodifacoum, and yes, there is, but we'll get into some other topics as well. I think the next one might be birds, so I'll be doing some bird presentations as well. So why don't I get up here? We're going to talk about Brodifacoum, of course, and so let me get my slideshow set up. There we go. And so, as you know, I call Brodifacoum the nuclear weapon of registered rodenticides. And again, registered means they're registered in North America, by specifically the United States. There are more toxic active ingredients for rodents, but they're not registered for rodent use here in the United States. So not really going to talk about those, obviously, although I might, if there's a request for it. We could certainly do some work for those of you who are listening outside of the United States. But nevertheless, in terms of the commensal rodenticides that we have here in the United States, Brodifacoum is arguably the most toxic available, and so it is an anticoagulant. So why don't we kind of lay some, just a reminder that this is a 2nd generation anticoagulant, so that's often called single feed, which just means that once the rodent takes 1 dose, it is pretty much a walking dead rodent. Now, that doesn't mean it stops with 1 dose, because there's a delayed effect with the anticoagulants, so he's actually eating more than 1 dose, and this is one of the concerns that people have with secondary poisoning. We're not necessarily going to be delving into that per se today, but nevertheless, you just need to understand that these 2nd gens, of which Brodifacoum is one of them, these 2nd generation anticoagulants are extraordinarily toxic in orders of magnitude over the 1st generation anticoagulants. And so if you're not familiar with that, the 1st generation anticoagulants are warfarin, difascinone, and chlorofascinone. And so that's pretty much how they're broken down for the first generation. So you may say, well, Stephen, I've missed the first 3 podcasts. It's okay. Each podcast stands on its own. I'm just giving you a little background here to let you situate yourself within the active ingredient world when we're dealing with rodenticides. So all rodenticides fall into 2 major categories: anticoagulants and non-anticoagulants. Anticoagulants are then subdivided into 2 categories, and that is first generation anticoagulants, second generation anticoagulants. And then, of course, the non-anticoagulants, as I said before, are already their own category. Brodifacoum is in the second gen category. All right, enough of that. Let's move on with our this article. This was an article published in 2023, so it's relatively recent. And the concern here, of course, is Brodifacoum resistance. You're like, wow, yes. Even though Brodifacoum is, as I call it, again, it's a little bit of tongue-in-cheek there, right? The nuclear weapon of rodenticides. Doesn't mean that we're not dealing with rats who can develop some resistance. Now, there are different kinds of resistance when we're dealing with rodenticides, or with any pesticide. Excuse me. So we need to be clear about what we mean by resistance. What they're meaning here is they're referring to sort of a genetic resistance or a biological resistance. There's also something called behavioral resistance, and that is not what we're referring to here. Behavioral resistance is like, well, you know that something is bad and you've just avoided it. That's a behavioral thing, and sometimes rodents do that. They get wise to a particular formulation, perhaps get to a particular odor, or perhaps a particular setup that you've made, and they're like, you know what, we're not touching that. That's not resistance at the biological or the chemical level. That's a resistance on the basis of a behavior. The rodent has decided for some reason not to interact with that bait. That is not what we're talking about here. We're talking here about biological resistance, and that is there is something in the genes or chemistry of these particular rodents that make it harder for them to succumb to Brodifacoum poisoning. Now, what we don't mean here is when we say the word resistance, we don't mean that they can just chow on Brodifacoum all day long and they're fine. No, that's good. That's being completely immune to Brodifacoum. We're not referring to immunity here. We're referring to resistance, which means if a rodent needed this much to control, this much Brodifacoum to kill it, resistant rodents need this much to kill it. So it just makes it harder to do something, okay? And that's what they've discovered, of course, out here in New Zealand. So let's take a look at this particular article that I'm summarizing for you. It is published by Wildlife Research, and so the article title is Apparent Resistance to Brodifacoum in Rattus, and that's the roof rat, if you weren't familiar with that, in a New Zealand site with no history of anticoagulant-based rodent control. And it was written by Suman P.K. Sran, Brett G. Gartrell, Penny Fisher, and Doug P. Armstrong. And that was published in 2023 in the journal Wildlife Research, Volume 50, Issue 1. So let me repeat that for you. It's apparent resistance to Brodifacoum in Rattus in a New Zealand site with no history of anticoagulant-based rodent control. Written by Suman P.K. Sran, Brett G. Gartrell, Penny Fisher, Doug P. Armstrong, and it was published in 2023 in the journal Wildlife Research, Volume 50, Issue 1. So this is concerning. So again, they're saying apparent, meaning they probably need to do some additional testing, but to confirm it. But nevertheless, there's some concern here. So they do a little bit of history on anticoagulant resistance. And of course, many of you know, if you've been doing anything involved in pest control for any length of time, you know that warfarin, which was the first generation anticoagulants, the first discovered anticoagulant rodenticide, was used extensively, and rodents developed a resistance to it, okay? And that occurred in Scotland in the 1950s. Other rodenticides, active ingredients, were developed or discovered, and these occurred in the 1960s in coumetril and difacilone. Those were developed in Europe. And then, of course, in the 1970s and 90s, we have bromadiolone and difenacoum. Those were also developed. And so these are, you can see it's sort of a war. The rodents get resistance, and then we produce a new product. The rodents get some resistance, we come up with a new product. And that's kind of how that all works out. What we have in New Zealand is a long-term use of Brodifacoum, because New Zealand, being an island country, they've had a lot of non-native species coming to the island. Typically things have jumped off of ships or they've been actively introduced, and they have devastated the native animals in their country. And so they've been working for decades now trying to suppress these invasive species to try to protect the native animals that they have in their country so that they don't go extinct. So they have done some incredible work in New Zealand. The research out of New Zealand and Australia is truly remarkable. They've done some amazing things scientifically in some of their studies, because there's so much money that they have available because they've taken this issue very seriously. So Brodifacoum is one of the products that they have used, and they basically used it sometimes to eliminate rats. Rats are a major predator of a lot of animals, and they've eliminated them at Raoul Island in 2002. And then they discovered in 2017, they've started seeing evidence of heritable genetic resistance, and here we have the mutation. I'll have to do it out for you. TYR25PHE mutation, number 8 of 482. Now, I don't understand all that. I'm assuming it's probably someplace on the DNA, on the DNA spiral, right? The double helix, somewhere on the DNA, and that's where roof rats were scheme mutation. So 8. They found this on 8 of the 42 roof rats screened. They found this mutation occurred. That's in 2017. So they've also done some things called blood clotting response tests, called a BCR test. And what they do is they compare how the coagulation times, how long does it take for the blood to coagulate. And so, as you know, these are anticoagulants that we're talking about. So if an animal has been exposed to anticoagulants, their clotting response should be delayed. It should be harder for the blood to clot. But if they're resistant, then the anticoagulant doesn't have the same impact as it would with a non-resistant rodent. So what they do is they compare the coagulation times before and after a sublethal dose called an effective dose, ED50. So you may be familiar with the LD50, which is lethal death, 50%. That is comparable with this, is where they put in a certain amount of anticoagulant rodenticide in this rodent to see where there's a change. Is there a change in blood spots? So those animals that are resistant are going to have it's going to be harder for that blood. It's going to be harder for that blood to not clot, which is a poor way of saying it. It'll make a little bit more sense as we get a little bit further into it. The beauty of this particular test, this BCR test, this blood clotting response test, is that no mortality is needed on the rodents. Okay, we don't have to kill the rodents. And they only need 24 hours to do the test, so they're able to repeat this. They can do this multiple times, and it's very sensitive. In other words, when they take the blood work, they can realize this, they get the answers really quick, which speeds up the results, of course, lowers the cost of the study and allows them to do a lot of repetitiveness, so they can really get good confidence intervals for this in this particular information. So their study goal, of course, was to determine the effective dose of 50%, right? 50% of the study sample of roof rats in an area that had never been exposed to Brodifacoum. And the area that they selected did have long-term use of 1080, but that's a different mode of action, okay? It's not the same as an anticoagulant. And they only used mature, healthy rats, and they went out and captured. These are wild rats, and so that's important. They're not lab rats. They're not raised in a laboratory. These were wild rats that they captured. So they captured 21 males and 15 females. And here's a picture of where they found those rats in the southern portion of the northern island. And then they kind of showed where their looks like where their trapping took place. So they've gathered these rats. They have them in a laboratory now, but these are wild rats. They have an acclimation period to let the rats kind of get comfortable, because there's a lot of stress when an animal gets pulled out of its native environment. And they separate them by gender, of course, and then they do what's called baseline blood levels. So they take some blood, and they just want to get what is the rodent at right now before they do any testing with it whatsoever. And then they know that the LD50, the lethal dose, 50% values for Brodifacoum for this species is anywhere from 0.46 milligrams per kilogram to as high as 0.77 milligrams per kilogram. So that's the standard. If you go look it up online, what is the LD50 for roof rats with Brodifacoum, it'll be somewhere between 0.46 and 0.77. And so they considered the roof rat susceptible to an anticoagulant dose if its INR reading, which I think is a function of how quickly their blood coagulates, is greater than or equal to 3.6. All right, we're kind of getting into the weeds here, but just bear with me and listen to what they have for their results. So the average clotting time for a roof rat is 9.6 seconds. And what they found was none of the rats had INR values of greater than or equal to 3.6. And here we have the numbers below. LD50, of course, is 0.4 to 0.77, but the effective dose was 2.88 to 3.81. There's a problem here, because the effective dose should be significantly lower than the lethal dose. In other words, the rat that's exposed to Brodifacoum at a lower level than what's a lethal dose should at least have some indication of losing its capacity to clot blood. The rats that they were testing here didn't have that, which means they're likely resistant, because the effective dose just means that the blood began to be more difficult to clot. That's a far cry different from killing the rodent. So the lethal dose for the rodent should be 0.4 milligrams per kilogram to 0.77 milligrams per kilogram. But in the rats they tested, the effective dose was over 2 milligrams, almost 3 milligrams to 4 milligrams, which is somewhere in the vicinity of 10 times, actually 40 times, probably 40 times the amount. Wow, I mean, that's a lot. So something's wrong here. So the effective dose was 3.7, so my math is wrong here, so let's go with the research here. The effective dose was 3.7 times the highest published dose, lethal dose, for Brodifacoum, treated roof rats and 6.2 times the LD50 for a previous study of New Zealand roof rats. That's bizarre. Remember, this is a location where there was no indication whatsoever that anticoagulants were ever used in this part of New Zealand. So where did this resistance come from? Okay. Now, the information at the bottom here gives you some LD50s for other animals. We have the Norway rat, of course, and the house mouse. And what the ED50 value, again, that's effective dose. That just means that the rodent should be exhibiting some level of coagulation problems at a non-lethal dose level of Brodifacoum. Notice the ED50 value for Norway rat is 0.22, but the LD50 value can be as high as 0.56. That makes sense. Where the house mouse lethal dose is 0.4 to 0.52, and the ED value is 0.35 to 0.39. That makes sense, because the ED value should be less than what it's needed to kill the rodent. Okay. Let me give an analogy. The amount of aspirin you need to eliminate a headache should be less than the amount needed to kill someone. Now, I don't want anyone to poison themselves with aspirin here, but we're just trying to use an analogy, right? The same way the Brodifacoum treatment of a rodent to get their blood to be a little harder to coagulate should be less than what's needed to kill the rodent. But in these roof rats that were tested in New Zealand, it is 3.7 times higher than what is needed, should be needed to kill them. Okay, that suggests some sort of resistance. So, what is the explanation for this? Because again, this area was never used for Brodifacoum rodenticide treatments. So, they didn't use anticoagulants in this part of New Zealand. So where did the resistance come from? So here's their explanation, their hypotheses, their theories. One theory is that, well, perhaps they had too much vitamin K. Well, they said, no, that's not the right answer, because the acclimation period, I think, which went on for 2 weeks, I believe, would have eliminated any excess vitamin K that would have been in their system. So that explanation is out the door. One possibility is that there's a natural variation of resistance to Brodifacoum that occurs ordinarily in wild populations. Okay, but a 3.7 times difference, that's a pretty big margin there, okay? And because they said that's possible, but not likely. Prior exposure to anticoagulants. Could there have been a prior exposure to anticoagulants in these roof rats? Well, we've already said that anticoagulants were not used in this part of New Zealand. But what they said was it is possible that due to the heavy control of rats using 1080, by creating a vacuum, in other words, when you have an environment that has rats, you eliminate the rats in that environment. The rats in the neighboring areas move in to take advantage of the habitat that you have now emptied of rats. Okay, that's normal migration. Like, for example, if you're dealing with squirrels and you're trapping squirrels in someone's backyard, and let's say you trapped 6 to 10 and you wiped it out. Give it a few weeks, new squirrels are going to move in as they redistribute themselves in the area, because they're like, hey, Joey over there, he's no longer around, and I really loved his tree, and there's a lot of food over there, and let me go check it out. So they begin to naturally move in, and so they're thinking that when they we're working on these rats with 1080, rats from areas that they were using Brodifacoum poisoning moved in and brought their resistance with them. Again, not certain, certainly possible, but I point this out to you that this is why it's important to keep track of what you're doing with rodenticides. If you're using the same active ingredient year after year after year, that's a problem. And you need to sort of make sure that you're breaking that by using an alternative active ingredient. And I know it's hard because you get, oh, this one really works, it's my go-to, and it's just easy. You can buy things in bulk, maybe get a little discount. It just takes one more thing off your head. The problem is that the resistance issue can creep up on you. And all of a sudden, you're putting bait out, but you're not getting the effect. And now you've got to really go to something that may be less effective, because sometimes an animal that's resistant in one anticoagulant can become resistant to another anticoagulant. So maybe you'll have to move to a non-anticoagulant like a bromethalin or a cocalciferol, right? But it's better to break that process. Every 3 to 4 years, move it to a different active ingredient. Switch it up to make sure you don't have this particular problem. All right, so something to think about, to be sure. Well, I hope you enjoyed that issue. We're doing, again, a deep dive on Brodifacoum. This will be my last presentation on Brodifacoum for a little while. I have some more topics to discuss, at least one more to deal with on Brodifacoum, but I'm going to hold off on that a minute. I think the next one will be getting into some birds. But if you have better ideas, would love to hear from you. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to get your ideas for a show that you would want to have. And of course, if you're looking for consultation, if you're looking for development of PowerPoints for training that you're going to be giving somewhere, definitely reach out. If you're looking for private training as well, love to talk to you about that as well, or perhaps even doing some ghostwriting for you. I think there's a lot more books out there in the community that need to be written, or perhaps you're going to write it and you need an editor to kind of help you get it together. Would love to hear from you. You can reach me again at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. We hope you've enjoyed listening to Wildlife Control Consultant Podcast, because this podcast is all about providing research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest management. Take care, everyone. This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant Podcast. Vertebrate pest control is an inherently dangerous activity involving risk of bodily injury to you, others, and or property. Vertebrate pest control also involves legal issues, so be sure to always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods when controlling pests. Wildlife Control Consultant LLC, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their affiliates are not responsible for your use of the information provided here. Always consult a qualified and appropriate professional before employing the information provided here.